This is why I need you and love you. All right. E. Cummings, may my heart always be open to little birds who are the secret of living. Whatever they sing is better than to know. And if men should not hear them, men are old. May my mind stroll about hungry and fearless and thirsty and supple. And even if it's Sunday, may I be wrong, for whenever men are right, they are not young. And may myself do nothing usefully and love yourself so more than truly. There's never been quite such a fool who could fail pulling all the sky over him with one smile. So Paul, our young and supple friend, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thank you for welcoming me this morning. What a pleasure to join you all today. It's been great to listen to the stories of so many of you over past months and so much history that we generally don't get when we see each other in church. So it's an honor to be here. I am the 10th generation of one Thomas Minor, the 8th son of a farming family in Chumagna, England. Seeing no future on a family farm, he set off for America in 1629 at the age of 21. I visited Chumagna in about 1982 and found a plaque on the wall of the church there placed by the Thomas Minor Society. Formed in America, they have a biennial in Stonington, Connecticut, founded by Thomas, his father-in-law, and 2 others. I attended one of the society's gatherings 18 years ago and met 300 of my cousins. My family growing up included my mother, my father, and 2 older brothers. I was a surprise and hence younger and not as close to them growing up. I also have a number of cousins. 3 of us were born within 3 months of each other in the summer of 1947. Unfortunately, both of them have died. One grandfather died months before I was born and the other when I was 4, so I never really knew either of them. One grandmother was a little, pardon this grammar car, a little like the Wicked Witch of the North. But Grandma Minor was probably the greatest influence on my growing up. I spent every summer with her on Canisius Lake, from the last day of school, moving her there on Memorial Day until the first day of September, up through the summer of my second year in college. She taught me manners, responsibility, work, dominoes, Scrabble, and card games. She was a shark. We watched a game show every day at noon, and she had the greatest collection of comics. She had a 1949 Cadillac, but about the time I was able to drive, she bought a little red Corvair. I love that car. This was before Ralph Nader. The lake is where I first learned to sail on a sunfish that leaked like a sieve, so prone to capsizing every time I came about and the water shifted inside. Her son, my father, was very talented and resourceful, but not a student. He went to business school for about a year and then was put to work by his father in a family shoe factory in Batavia, P.W. Minor and Son Shoes, which was started right after the Civil War. Dad handled all the engineering and maintenance issues, and later he said that they had to hire 3 people to replace him when he left. He loved photography and for a while ran a photo store and studio in Batavia, all day in the store and much of the night in the dark room, which led to his eventual collapse and the sale of a business. That's about the time that Sylvania came to Batavia and he went to work fixing TVs before shipping, something he did for the next 25 years. My mother, the 3rd of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, of Claude Carr, who founded CL Car Company on Main Street, Batavia's finest store, and Harriet Wickham Carr. Mom, Christine, was the darling of the family. Her father bought her a harp for her 16th birthday because she saw one and thought she'd like to play. She did pursue lessons and graduated from Oberlin Conservatory. She and her sister often put on programs together, piano, harp, and singing. I was not around for much of this, but she developed a program for the harp for school assemblies, and she would perform besides telling the history. She had an agent and would go on tour along the East Coast for 3 to 4 weeks at a time, driving alone. This is in the 1950s, pulling this funny trailer behind her, much of the time in the South during the time of Jim Crow. She went on a 4-week tour about 6 weeks after I was born because I had signed a contract and it wasn't right to back out. My father and a wonderful elderly woman took care of me during that time. With 3 children, she finally stopped touring, but played regularly with the Genesee Symphony in Batavia. Instead, she took up selling the Lincoln Library, a wonderful encyclopedia and 2 books. This allowed her to be at home more. It was obvious to me as I grew up that my parents were emotionally distant and never showed their feelings for each other or us. The only time I ever saw my father angry was when I got my first speeding ticket. Feelings were never a part of my growing up, except with my grandmother Minor. To my dad, I was this little Sharpie, following his rototiller, picking up stones as he tried to prepare a new lawn for our new house. To my mother, I was an audience, someone to listen to her stories about most everything in day life. I was not at home a lot, at the lake in the summer, working at my grandfather's department store after school, and in our dark room in the basement, processing pictures I had taken at school functions well into the night. Things I remember about growing up was working at cars, taking inventory in the unheated warehouse in February, dusting furniture, and cleaning the elevator pit while the elevator was still running above me. OSHA would have had a fit. But employees always compared me favorably to my grandfather Carr, whom they held in the highest regard. I never knew him, but their comments always stuck with me and buoyed me. After graduating from Batavia High, I attended Syracuse University School of Architecture for 6 years. It was there I met a music student, Susan. We were married in Batavia in 1969, with 2 years of graduate school ahead of me. Susan was in music education until her first day in the classroom and came home and said, "I can't do this." She then switched her major to special education and mental retardation. She later went back to teaching music. It was after graduation with my master's in architecture that we moved to the Boston area. My thesis had been on urban residential rehabilitation, and New York City and Boston seemed to be the epicenters, and Susan was from New Hampshire. She went on to get her master's degree at Boston University. After a year of living in Cambridge, we moved to Concord because Susan wanted to live near the ocean on a fledgling architect salary. Exploring various towns, we saw and fell in love with Concord, and soon after found First Parish Church when a lecture event brought the Nobel physicist George Wald to town to speak. At the end, a little old woman in the back stood up and said, "What are we going to do if Richard Nixon gets elected president again?" And we knew we had found our home. It wasn't until 1987 that we had our first and only child, a son, Travis, named after my grandmother, Nellie Travis Minor. Burned out from several years working in day activity programs for the retarded, Susan started to teach piano at home and eventually became a teacher at a private girls' school, got a second master's in piano performance, and was an incredible musician for 50 years. She performed the Mozart D minor piano concerto with the Concord Orchestra when she was 8 months pregnant with Travis. The hospital is right across the street, just in case. She still plays chamber music, regular church services, several choruses, and an occasional music theater. This exposure fostered my appreciation of fine classical music. I spent 20 plus years in the Concord chorus, sang in the First Parish choir for nearly as many years. I also worked behind the scenes with the Concord Players, mostly producing. My first production was The Music Man, with a live horse on stage during the Wells Fargo wagon scene. Deep down, I think I was meant to be a theatrical producer. I seemed to work well behind the scene. In December 1989, there was widespread revolt in Romania, and Nicolae Ceausescu, General Secretary of the Communist Party, was tried and executed. Several months later, there was a special on TV documenting the abysmal care of children in their orphanages, film footage that was taken by a colleague of mine. Ian Baranday had left Romania years earlier after completing architecture school. He created the Free Romania Foundation to help improve the condition in these institutions. Being close to Ian as a colleague, I became a board member of the Free Romania Foundation. Besides raising money and sending supplies to help these children, doctors and nurses were being sent to provide long neglected care. After Ian's presentation at First Parish, 2 members, a nurse and a dentist, traveled to several of these orphanages for 1 to 2 month stints. In time, with the reemergence of religious freedom in Romania, the UUA was promoting the Association of Unitarian Universalist Churches in the United States with Unitarian churches in Romania. First Parish in Concord was one of those to form a partnership, later to become a covenant. Our partner was the church in Seca Carister. Our minister, Gary Smith, had visited and formed a close bond with their minister. The idea was widely accepted at First Parish, and the following year, our choir director arranged a trip with 24 souls traveling to Romania. We stayed in the homes of church members and sang in their church, along with several other churches in Romania. That relationship still exists, with groups of adults and/or youth going to Seca Carister about every other year, often for a week-long work project. Over the years, First Parish provided money for a new boiler for the church, a car for the minister, and other things they needed. About 10 years ago, a delegation from the church in Seca Carister came to Concord and presented a check for $10,000 in appreciation for all that Concord had done for them. In 2012, Judy Bennett, she comes up soon, and I planned a grand tour vacation to include Italy, the Czech Republic, and at my insistence, Romania. Judy was actually okay with this because it reminded her of Lithuania, where she spent 2 years in the Peace Corps soon after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Arrangements were made to stay in the church's guest house, and the son of the family I stayed with in 2002 became our interpreter, chauffeur, and tour guide. Such memories of my earlier trip. We even scheduled our trip to celebrate Easter with our friends in Seca Carister, a very much different celebration than either Concord or Rochester would have at Easter. Part of that trip was meeting with the minister of 2 very tiny UU congregations lacking a partner in the United States. Maybe First Unitarian would be interested. We were later told it would be a difficult sell with the church's already successful Honduran project. But issues separate from Travis's birth led to my eventual divorce from Susan in 1997, with shared custody, every week trading 1 child, 3 cats, 1 dog, and all the belongings of an 8-year-old. At times, we had to make several trips because 1 or more of the cats didn't come the first time. After that, I dated a lot. Match.com was big back then. But in 2004, I got the notion that I wanted to return to my Western New York roots. A high school classmate had told me of a friend buying a house in the South Wedge for $25,000. Geez, I could buy 5 of those. I thought, wow, this was also to be for semi-retirement. I was in my late 50s. I already had family here. Unfortunately, 4 of those family members have died. Scouring the South Wedge, looking for houses, and still playing match, I eventually met Judy Bennett. She was the director of the Ontario County Office of the American Red Cross and lived in Canandaigua. Not quite the South Wedge, but she wooed me with a family boathouse at the end of Canandaigua Pier and the future home of my 22-foot sailboat. She was involved for many years with farm workers, working for Rural Opportunities, which later became Pathstone. She still sits on one of Pathstone's boards. Judy owned an art gallery in downtown Canandaigua for several years, and after divorcing her husband is when she headed off to the Peace Corps for 2 years at age 52. We were married at the Canandaigua Yacht Club, and she and her maid of honor arrived for the ceremony in the family's 1953 Chris Craft. The evening ended with the annual Ring of Fire around Canandaigua Lake and the most incredible full moon. In September, we celebrated 12 years together. Regardless, I still maintain a close relationship with Travis's mom and visit whenever I go back to Massachusetts, either for work or just simply to see Travis and his wife, Becca. Travis, my son, graduated from the University of Vermont and has a master's degree in education from Harvard. He founded the successful tutoring and test prep company in the western suburbs of Boston, successfully continuing to work with students and his staff as tutors as he and his wife traveled around the country for 10 months in their RV, zooming all the way from coast to coast. He met Becca in junior high school and they celebrated their 7th anniversary in August. Becca obtained her master's degree in social work from Boston University and is now a licensed clinical social worker and therapist with a unique niche of working primarily with LGBTQ and transgender young people and their parents. She has a full schedule. My work. Somehow I decided to become an architect about 8th grade. Do we all remember the Cooter preference test that we were given then? I still have a wonderful letter from my uncle, who's a successful architect in New York City with over 80 employees. He said, regardless if I actually become an architect after graduation, it was one of the finest educations one could pursue. It taught you critical thinking, problem solving, and working cooperatively. One of his classmates went on to become the head of New York Central Railroad. In spite of never having taken any art or mechanical drawing courses in my 4 years of Batavia High School, Syracuse University School of Architecture accepted me. In the summer of my 2nd year, I started working for a small firm, 2 partners. Mrs. Gillespie was 65, Mr. Granger was 80, and I've never stopped since then. After graduation, I worked for 5 years in Boston, rehab mostly, and after being laid off after another economic downturn, I was presented the opportunity to start my own firm in 1976 when a couple of kids torched a church in Boston on Halloween, and the contractor hired to board it up knew of me and suggested I get in touch with them. I was totally unprepared, no planning, no saved money, and yet have been a sole practitioner for over 45 years now, doing the same thing. But people always said you're supposed to change careers like 7 times in your lifetime. My specialty has been working with existing buildings, rehab, reuse, repurpose, and additions. With nearly 700 clients, I've done churches, commercial buildings, and residential. You'll note churches. I've always said I like working with committees. Most people don't believe me. One person will always become the de facto leader, and I mostly have to listen and then put consensus to paper. With residential projects, I often find myself practicing marriage counseling. One client actually got divorced during the bidding process on their new house. The husband kept the land and several years later came back with his new wife and had me design an entirely new house. Several of my projects have been subject of affirmative decisions in the Massachusetts Superior Court. Congregate housing now allowed in residential neighborhoods. Same for group residences for the mentally challenged. Wins for progressive ideas. Also, we've finally more clearly defined what constitutes a non-conformance in zoning codes for Massachusetts. I joined the American Institute of Architects, and over these many years did things through the Boston Society of Architects. I was a member of Architects for Social Responsibility back when anti-nuclear war was prevalent. I founded the Sole Practitioners Luncheon Group, meeting for nearly 10 years. I planned a weekend guided by the National AIA, specifically on professional practice for sole practitioners and small firms. We planned several panels for specifically for sole practitioners at the National AIA Convention in Boston in 1992. We promoted the work of sole practitioners at home shows with booths and lectures. We presented a course on adult ed for people thinking about building. But I've seen changes too. My first building, I like to think of as going from boats to boots to joints. It was designed to display quiet sports, sailboats, canoes, cross-country skiing. Then the building was sold and became a liquor store. And now, 45 years later, it's a medical marijuana dispensary. Another has gone from selling and servicing cars to become a store for high-end games, and then now it's a martial arts studio. One church I worked on has been converted into condominiums. Another church, my original work has been engulfed by subsequent additions. You can't even see what I did. And then another, one I really feel good about, was a wonderful church addition in a country setting on this road that was so beautiful from the road. And then they came along and built a CVS mini mall in front of it. You can only see the steeple beyond. I believe the one project I am most proud of, though, was 21 years ago, a youth program, United Teen Equality Center, UTEC. I became involved with the selection and subsequent preparation for initial occupancy of an abandoned church for this new program. This was through the Jericho Road, a project of First Parish, to connect the special skills and talents of people in our affluent community with the needs of fledgling nonprofits in a nearby community of poverty to help them build capacity and grow their mission. All services through Jericho Road were pro bono. With a subsequent small addition and additional work in the original building by another architect, I had already moved west to Rochester. It became the oldest LEED Platinum certified building in the country. During a slow period in my own practice, an engineer and good friend asked if I could draw up plans for homeless shelters. It was a project he was working on with Harvard School of Public Health to verify the efficacy of ultraviolet light in killing the tuberculosis bug in the air of high-risk environments over the next 3 to 4 years so that I could obtain accurate field measurements. He and I traveled to 10 or 12 clinics for the New York State Office of Alcohol and Substance Abuse in downstate New York. This was followed by a grant from Harvard School of Public Health to study homeless shelters in 5 cities: New York, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Birmingham, Alabama, and Dallas, documenting 3 to 4 shelters in each city for the study. The idea was these lights would be active for 6 months and then become a placebo for 6 months over a 5-year period, and recording the transmission of TB. What I questioned silently, and at times vocally, was the transient nature of the homeless. Every night, they might be in a different shelter. Therefore, would a test one day be valid the next? And how to track such a mobile population? The constant would be staff, especially nurses, and that's what the study would ultimately focus on. During one of these trips to New York, I had a free afternoon and was close by, so I decided to visit the World Trade Center. One could actually go to the roof of one of the towers. It was the most incredible view. You could look down to the street below and see tiny little people scurrying around like ants and teensy cars. And then I saw the most incredible sunset over New Jersey. It was so sad to see what happened just a few years later. I can't imagine the horror of leaping from one of those upper floors. Coincidentally, the same UV lights are being used today to help protect us against the COVID-19. But this work, this variety of people and places, this connection with my clients, seeing something I had a hand in come to fruition. Almost universally, the feedback has been positive and keeps me alive and still practicing 50 years later. The past 12 years, I professed semi-retirement and said January 1st of this year would be full retirement. I'm now busier than I've been in a long time, with 3 significant projects in Massachusetts and 1 here in New York for my niece. How does one say no to your own family? During my Concord days, I started experiencing incredible fatigue, taking more and more naps, having a nap after getting dressed in the morning, after breakfast, after lunch. There were many doctor's visits and tests until it was suggested that I might have Marfan syndrome, disease of the connective tissue, common to a lot of tall, skinny people. Abe Lincoln had it. After a short visit with a cardiologist at Leahy Clinic outside of Boston, I was told to prepare for open heart surgery within the month. Besides repairing one valve and replacing the other, the surgeon was going to install a tube within my slightly enlarged aorta, which could suddenly dissect and cause death within minutes. When he opened it up, there was nothing left but the mitral valve to repair. Essentially, there was no valve in one of my chambers. Earlier, I had been given the option of a pig's valve, which might have to be replaced in 10 years or so, or metal valves, which meant being on blood thinner for the rest of my life. You might even be able to hear the clicking of my metal valves right now. Still going strong after 21 years. That was a good choice. And aside, the operation was immediately after the Bush-Gore election, when we didn't know who won. I joked that when I finally woke up after the operation, we would know who won. Silly thought, it was months later. My introduction to church and religion was the First Baptist Church in Batavia. They had theater, excuse me. The First Baptist Church had theater-type seats and a huge painting of Jesus with a lamb on his shoulders on the wall behind the pulpit. I had a full immersion baptism at 12. But then the minister wanted to bring low-income housing to Batavia, which so upset my grandmother, the Wicked Witch, that she moved the whole family next door to the Presbyterian Church. My parents, my aunts, my uncles, and all my cousins. I soon became president of the youth group and participated in their service trip to Morgantown, West Virginia. This was the church, the Presbyterian Church, where I performed in piano recitals as a youngster and eventually married for the first time. I have since been back for numerous funerals. Don't we all remember the green jello with little marshmallows that the ladies of the church would make for receptions after things like this? I now go back several times a year for Los Samaritanos, volunteers helping people being released from the federal detention center in Batavia, helping them to get to family or friends in all parts of the country. After a 55-year absence from the church, it all looks so good, so familiar, and good to be back there. The minister for the past 10 years is a young woman from Syria. How my grandmother might have reacted to that. Then to school in Syracuse. The closest thing to religion for 6 years was singing in the Methodist chapel choir for a year. I remember nothing about the services. I've already covered my years in Concord at First Parish. Dana McLean Greeley, or just plain Dana, president of the Unitarian Association at 25 Beacon Street when we joined with the Universalists in 1963. First Parish was Dana's retirement church, having grown up in nearby Lexington. When I moved to Canandaigua, I got Judy to try their small UU church. It was the first time that we heard Scott Taylor and Karen Anderson and were so impressed. We also met Petra Mann, part of the Soul Matters packet this month, as she was just beginning her journey to connect with the earth. Several years later, we would move to Rochester and start attending First Unitarian Church here. But I digress. I first saw First Unitarian Church in 1996 on a field trip with the School of Architecture. Like Jack Manloff's comment a few months back about trying to understand this church. I saw a totally bare sanctuary. No chairs, no banners on the wall, just a flat platform with a large vase and a leafless twig sticking out of it. And I just said to myself, what kind of a weird religion is this? And all these years later, I'm now part of you. So, what speaks to my inner self, my religion? I've never gone for preparing for life after death. Instead, believing in a good person, believing, in being a good person for those who's in this life. It's our purpose, not to gain brownie points. I've always toyed with the idea of reincarnation. I got that part from Dana Greeley's wife, Deb. Interesting to think about. Since joining First Unitarian about 10 years ago, I've started questioning my spirituality. What does that mean? I find sermons intellectually stimulating, learning something, or moving me to take action, however large or small. Social action of some sort has always been in my blood, whether I recognized it or not. In 2003, Travis and I joined the good souls of the Littleton, Mass. UU Church on a bus to Washington to protest George Bush's war in Iraq. Of course, that led to 2017. Hearing of the Women's March in Washington, I said, of course you Jews are going to DC for this march. I had a bus all reserved, ready to put on my credit card, when Reverend Joel stepped in and nicely said, maybe we should do this through the church, insurance, things like that. Hoping to fill one bus, we ended up with two buses, with folks from First Unitarian, First Universalist, St. Thomas Episcopal, Temple Brith Kodesh, and folks from a women's legal association here in Rochester. There were bandanas to identify us. In a large crowd of nearly 500,000 people, hardly. We had maps and we had food for the overnight trip home. It's an experience never to be forgotten, and we only lost one person along the way. Soon after, I was asked to be a member of the Social Justice Council at a time when the church was in transition. Only John Keevert, Tom Perry, and I were on the SJC, and a board member essentially told us, do whatever. When Reverend Carlos arrived, he got me involved in immigration, attending rallies here in Rochester and a federal detention center in Batavia, entertaining a variety of different groups dealing with immigrants and farm workers in our church. First Unitarian Church became known as a welcoming and safe place for people working on very sensitive issues. The difficulty was there wasn't a lot actually going on with ICE activity in Rochester, other than maybe at the bus station. So it was hard to find activities for church members to volunteer. The Greenlight Driver's License Campaign was probably the most notable, with several of our members, Roberta, Mary, Hemley, and several others, very active in that. But just before Sherry's arrival, there was an outpouring of donated goods from our church for a farm family in Albion when ICE detained the farm worker husband. From those gatherings, I connected with a former member of our church who has a tiny church for farm workers west of Rochester. She was concerned about people being released on bond from the federal detention center, often with no money, no food, and usually inappropriate clothing for the season, just dropped off at a gas station to await a bus. That led to the Los Samaritanos project in Batavia. Sometime this past year or so, I realized I was burned out and have gone quiet. You've not seen a lot of me, a lot of activity. But as I continued to struggle with what is spirituality, what is my spirituality, even in numerous Soul Matters gatherings, and you'll recognize this, Anita, something that Reverend Sherry said in one of her sermons this past year made me see that my spirituality is in what I do every day. It's how I'm living my life. And who knows what will next manifest itself. Sorry to be so long-winded, but thank you, Libby.
Don't thank me, Paul. Thank you. Can we ask you questions?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I'm going to take you off the spotlight so that we can go back to gallery view and see everybody. And, you know, I love the way you presented this because I'd come up with a question and then you'd answer it down the road a little bit. So I'm going to see whether anybody else has questions about Vicky. Go ahead.
Yes, Paul, thank you very much. After your first impression of First Unitarian Church of Rochester architecturally, what do you think of it now?
Good question.
Oh, I like what is possible to do in the sanctuary. The several ministers that I've known while being a member there and create special occasions. I enjoy it. I am used to the New England meeting house type church. So it was a big change to come, but I actually heard a lecture a while back, maybe it was on the 50th anniversary, and there was an architect, I think out of Syracuse, talking about it, and he pointed out details I hadn't noticed before, and so have greater appreciation for it. And I realize it's a shrine that people come from as far away as Japan to see.
Yeah.
It needs a big place to congregate. The biggest thing in Concord was underneath the sanctuary and close inside was a room afterwards where they would have coffee hour. It was easy to mingle. There was plenty of space. That's back when coffee was served in china cups with ladies with white gloves on.
So Paul, you talked about your uncle saying something about architecture being a really valuable education, but I wondered whether you knew earlier in your life that that was something you were drawn to.
I look back now and think I probably would have enjoyed being a construction manager. I went into architecture because I was always fascinated at how buildings were put together. I would look at foundations and steel structure and try and envision what's coming next. And I've joked to some people that in retirement, I'm going to take up Legos. I've experimented with it some. My son gave me my first Lego project about 1.5 years ago. And I realize it's that you're dealing with a bunch of parts and trying to envision, how is this going to go together? What's it going to look like in the end? And construction of new buildings is very much like that. And so managing the process would have been quite satisfactory. It's like producing stage plays, what goes on behind the scene to get your final product, what goes before the public.
Deborah, go ahead.
This has been wonderful, Paul. Thank you so much. So I'm curious about what type of projects, because you do churches and commercial and residential, which ones interest you the most? And I'm also interested at what architectural type you most like to look at. What's most pleasing to you?
Hi, Patty.
I think it's the existing buildings. Details. And I'll walk around and maybe never use it, but I will take pictures of things I see. I'm a great imitator. If I see a detail, I will try and find a way to use it someplace. I've never thought of myself as a creative designer. I'm good at planning, laying out, but to create the final aesthetic. And maybe that's why working with existing buildings is good, because you're not starting with a blank piece of paper. You're starting with something, how do I deal with this?
Yeah. And earlier when you were answering a question, you said that you noticed some details in the church that helped you appreciate the church more. Can you tell us a couple of those?
Well, on the exterior, you have these vertical brick walls that frame the windows. I don't know that you've ever realized at the bottom, there is a horizontal line that sort of ties it together.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like these walls go into the ground, but it's part of a whole structure that is sitting on the ground because of the addition of that horizontal section. It's brick below the window. I was fascinated. I'm trying to think who now sent me drawings of the original building, and to realize how thick the sanctuary walls are. They're about 2 feet thick. It's because it's part of the heating ventilating system.
Mm-hmm.
There are maybe Carl remembers, it's your historian at the church, and he has a wonderful trove of photographs of the construction of the church at all various stages. And some of that should be made more publicly available.
Yeah. Great. Well, now I have to go look at the outside of the building next time I'm there for the
Yeah.
horizontal line. Thank you.
Yeah. Ruth has her hand up. Go ahead.
Yes,
Ruth.
thank you, Paul. That was really a very interesting presentation. I thought you might appreciate, I don't know whether you ever heard the story, but several years ago, we had a visiting minister who had been in the church before. And he was remarking on his earliest experience, and he came into the sanctuary as you did when there were no chairs. He was having a tour. I don't know whether the weavings were up at that point, but he turned to the person who was giving him the tour and said, "Well, this is marvelous. You're all so lucky to have a gymnasium in your church."
You know, I do work with some African-American churches, and that's always an experience. In fact, there's one project in Boston right now that has been going on for 2 years. It's with the New Rehoboth Pentecostal Bethel Church, something like that. And I've actually tried to back out twice. And I get on a Zoom call with a minister and members of his family and someone else from the church, and they talk me back into it. And the last meeting at the very beginning, Bishop Washington starts out by telling what a wonderful thing I've been doing for the church, and I'm so good. And this is about 2 years after I was first interviewed, and the person who brought me into the room said, "Remember, Paul is a good guy. I'm in a room of people of color, and I'm being told I'm a good guy." When Bishop Washington was done extolling what I meant to them, I said, "I hope you outlive me so you can come speak at my memorial service." And I'm still involved in the project.
Is somebody else waving their hand? Dave Friedman, go ahead.
Do you get called in to work on churches that were done like these cookie cutter things? Some churches are thrown up from pre-existing plans to look like other churches. And do you get into projects like that? And you do anything to bring a particular character to that building?
Yeah, for a while, a company out of Massachusetts, not Acorn, one of those that sort of did packaged buildings, were doing a lot of churches. And the one that I really loved was sort of H-shaped. And they had a sanctuary that also served as their their dining space and things like that. I mean, there were a few things that designated it as a church, but the vinyl tile floor, things like that. And they knew they wanted some more classrooms, and they wanted to do something to make the sanctuary nicer. In the end, we ended up, and all that really identified the building was that the end of one leg of the wing was a cross on the building. And that was it, no steeple or anything like that. And we ended up with sort of an octagonal shape filling in one end of the H. And that became the sanctuary, wonderful tall stained glass windows. And we put a steeple on top, and it really was outstanding what you could see from the road. And then they built CVS in front of it. It's the old adage, if you like the view, you got to own it. And they had a piece of property that for whatever reason they needed to sell off.
And Teese has her hand up. Unmute.
Thank you, Paul. It was a great presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
In 2017, I was on your bus trip, and it was amazing. I was so impressed how well organized it was, and thinking about the identifying the group, the bandanas and stuff. And it was very well thought out. And I guess the commitment that helped me get involved in local politics, and I've been in the Harrington Democrat group since then. And I go door to door and talk to people and stuff. I'm not one of the leaders in the group, and I also watch the news a lot. So your activism in that was sort of instrumental in me getting more involved in the way I am now. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm surprised nobody's asked who we lost on that trip.
Oh,
Who did you lose, Paul?
I won't name names, but this is like 5:30 at night. Everybody's supposed to be coming on the red line out of Washington to the very end where our buses were. We were going to leave at 6 o'clock. And of course, all our cell phones are beginning to run out of charge. So we're lacking ways to communicate. And I finally made the decision, everybody start getting on the buses. A few stragglers were coming in, they got on the buses, and I was ready to tell the buses, roll. If he ever shows up, we're going to rent a room overnight and we'll get back the next day. But he showed up at the very last minute, not realizing that there was any concern about nobody could find him.
Oh. So I wondered whether social justice was part of your family tradition, or if it's something that you grew into as a result of connections you made over the years.
My father was on the board of the Salvation Army for a while. I really wasn't aware of his involvement there. In church, we weren't exposed to it through the Boston Society of Architects. It was more the anti-nuclear war. I think maybe it was the first exposure to Romania and the connections there, and beginning to think about how other people live. I mean, I grew up in lily white Batavia. I rarely traveled outside the county. So I didn't realize what a privileged life I had. And I think it was just, I was at Syracuse when the students at Kent State were killed, and remember being on the quad with thousands of other students and just sort of numb. I remember when Bobby Kennedy there came on his campaign. The architecture school had a strike at one point, but I was never into it. I was too much bookie, I guess, at the time, and probably going to First Parish and getting involved with them. We had the where you write postcards to political prisoners and things like that. Some of those small things, and it just crept in.
Deborah, go ahead.
Sorry, Libby, did I cut you off? If you want to ask another question?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, Paul, I'm interested about your grandmother who was the wicked witch and the one who was the generous one. Which was which? Your
Grandma Minor, my father's mother, was the one at the lake, and she's the one I really loved. The wicked witch would stand in her front porch while you were raking her front yard and say, well, don't put the leaves in front of me. Put them over next in front of the YWCA. She would always, no matter what time our family had dinner, she would make sure she would call in the middle of it. She was once caught driving down the middle of Main Street, and an officer pulled her over, and she said, don't you know I'm Mrs. C.L. Carr?
Oh.
So, and I'm not the only one in my family that have these feelings about dear Grandma Carr.
but you said earlier that you could express a lot of emotion.
Deborah, we're having a little trouble hearing you. I think you're.
Is that
That's
better?
There we go.
Much better.
That you said that neither of your parents expressed a lot of emotion, but it sounds like your grandmother Minor was very generous that way.
Absolutely. Nothing like getting a hug from her. But you had to, every time you went from the cottage down to the water, you had to pull your 100 weeds for the day. You had to make your bed. And I mean, just teaching responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
And
Jack and Sandy.
Scrabble and dominoes.
Yeah, reminds me of my grandmother. The Maniloffs have their hand up, and that'll be our last question today, I think.
Paul, thank you so much. It was just fascinating. Towards the end of your talk, you mentioned that you're retiring, but you haven't talked about turning down any projects. Have you really turned down any projects?
Well, my brother said, you just have to say no. And actually on the bulletin board above my computer is the card that the Reverend Marcus passed out a number of years ago that says no on it. So my brother is saying this, when his daughter comes and says, I want to put an addition on the house so that dad can move in when he can no longer support himself. What am I supposed to say? One project in Massachusetts started out as a first floor project of an Ace Hardware. And now the second floor is being converted into salons for hairdressers. The church for the African-American congregation has been going on for over 2 years. It's just something, it's hard to walk away. And I actually did turn down a tiny project a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah,
Let-
practice. Go ahead, Jack.
Just an observation. Over the elder tree presentations, there's been one word that's common to many of us, and the word is grandmother.
Really?
Oh, I've got to go back and listen to some more. I remember her love of turquoise. She always had like a dozen silver rings on her wrist. Yeah, those years at Canisius Lake were some of the best.
And you're talking about her reminds me of my grandmother, and I bet many of us remember and the elder buddies and I were thinking about around the time of the remembrance service at church that maybe we'll have a time to remember, and maybe we could focus that on grandmothers.
Cool.
That might be kind of fun to give us all because they were so different, and yet so many of them had such a huge effect on our lives. I love that idea. Thanks for pointing that out, Jack. Because we are now the grandmothers, many of us, not all, I know.
Not yet.
But many of us are the grandparents. And so that's a lovely link to remember.
Paul used a word with regard to that, and the word is love.
Yes.
And that's how many of us remember.
I never pointed out that she lost one of her 4 children about age 23 to rheumatic fever. He'd always been sick, and his name was Paul.
Oh. Well, I have loved listening to your presentation, Paul. Thank you so much. And I am off to be with my grandkids now. So we'll be together next week. Vicki Schwartz is going to tell us her story, and I've lost that. I put stuff in the note to you all. If you're not on my list, let me know. But I think everybody who's on here now is on the list, and it tells you who's coming up for the next while. I love you all. Have a wonderful day. Even if it's raining, I'm sure there's something wonderful to do. And I will see you all next week. Take
Thank you.
care. Bye. Thank you, Paul.